All right, we are going to get started. Welcome back to a season 2 episode of At the Table with the TRA's podcast. But today we're doing it a little bit differently. I'm Joe Monastero, Chief Operating Officer of the Texas Restaurant Association, your co-host.
And your other co-host, Ben Noor, the Director of Partnerships. Looking forward to having you all today. And then with us today, we have Josh Seacrest with our member value partner, Paradox, and we look forward to having him. Good afternoon, everyone. We are very excited to bring you our very first live episode of At the Table with the TRA. Today, we are bringing an important topic to the table, and it couldn't have come at a better time. Since this episode has a different structure, we are inviting our listeners to come join us at the table at the end of the episode, where we will talk openly about today's topic. Please submit your question in the chat box during the episode or toward the end when we get together at the table. So what are we talking about today? Today, we are talking artificial intelligence and how it can help your restaurant's hiring efforts. The National Restaurant Association just released their 2023 State of the Industry report, and for 3 years straight, recruiting employees has been the biggest challenge for restaurant operators. Joe, what do you think that is?
Well, at the end of the day, we all know that our industry grows fast, and we certainly have been doing that even throughout 3 very challenging years. Prior to the pandemic, we had 47% of operators saying their number one challenge was having enough people. And during the pandemic, obviously, some other things were keeping their attention, but still holding on to their employees was always an issue. And now coming out of the pandemic, it is as high as 78% in some quarters of 2023. Texas alone currently is still looking for about 25 to 30,000 industry employees across the state. At the nationwide level, that number is closer to 250,000. We ourselves project that within the next 2 to 3 years, the rate of growth that Texas is currently experiencing, we're going to need about 300,000 employees. So figuring out ways to operate smarter, operate faster, and tackling this topic of AI that is an interesting 2-letter word that's become kind of scary out there in the world. So we're just going to kind of call that out there and say, we want to talk about it openly. We want to bring in experts to help you understand it. We as the Texas Restaurant Association are throwing a flag in the ground that we're going to do everything in our power to bring you the latest, greatest information, help make it seem a little bit more approachable, not necessarily this 2-letter word that you're not sure what to do with in your restaurant, and really give you things that you can immediately implement on your day-to-day operations and use it. So with that, I will just add my welcome to our first time doing a live episode of At the Table. We don't have the opportunity to edit as we normally do, so we're going to do our best to go through this here with Josh and not mess up too much, but one way or another, it'll be an entertaining episode. And this episode will then also be streaming on our podcast channel via audio. So with that, we both mentioned already, we've got Josh Seacrest, the Vice President of Marketing and Client Advocacy with Paradox AI, a member value partner with the TRA. Paradox specializes in conversational recruiting software, using AI to automate the tasks the hiring teams don't have time for, sifting through those applications, doing those initial conversations to set up the interviews so that you can focus on what's most important, serving your customers, being engaged, being the face of the restaurant on the floor, and then having that face-to-face engaging conversation with an interview with your potential employees.
So before we start drilling Josh with some questions, I'd like our listeners to get to know him a little bit better. Josh is the Vice President of Client Advocacy at Paradox. Prior to joining Paradox, he led talent and talent acquisition teams for some of the world's largest brands. During his time at McDonald's, like we all know, Josh was head global talent acquisition, where he helped develop next-gen hiring technologies, including the world's first conversational applicant tracking system and voice-activated application alongside Paradox. Josh also spent over 13 years at Abercrombie & Fitch, where he led global talent acquisition, culture, and philanthropy, and he graduated from Yale University with a degree in economics. Josh, welcome to our first ever live podcast about the table. So glad to have you.
Oh my goodness, thanks for having me. I'm pumped up here.
Well, let's dive right in and tackle the complexity around AI. Josh, what does it really mean and how does it affect the restaurant industry?
Ooh, that's a good one. The answer today is pretty different than it was a few years ago, right? Maybe right off the bat, and I know we're calling this the AI episode, but I'd almost just say like automation, think of it as automation, and automation has gotten just like so much simpler, faster, and better over the last few years. It's gotten exponentially better. And so if we think about distilling AI into more of just like simple terms of like, what can it do for me? What can it automate? What can it make simpler in my restaurants? It's kind of an easier frame, right? Because you'd say, there's some super like human components that I am always going to want to keep in my restaurants, things that are customer facing or high impact moments, those magical moments. But there are also some things that are pretty administrative or logistical. It's why we're seeing in QSR probably a lot are using more AI or automation in like drive-through. There's some that's happening obviously in our kitchen spaces. When we all walk around the big show, you see a tremendous amount that's happening there. But I'm biased, but we have the numbers to kind of show for it. Within the hiring space, it's actually been one of the fastest adopted places to use automation. And it's also been one of the places just to get the easiest return on investment. You're paying typically under $1,000 per restaurant to bring in some sort of like automated hiring technology. And fairly quickly, you're able to hire in days versus weeks. You're removing hours from kind of some tedium that your managers are having. You're helping your customers experiencing your restaurants more frequently fully staffed. So pretty interesting what it's already starting to do in that restaurant space. So making things easier, and I'd say it's not only smarter, but it feels less. I hate to say like less scary, but because it's so simple to use now, and it's giving great responses and doing the tasks that I think we'd want it to do, it's much easier to adopt and train our teams on.
Most definitely. And we were just actually having this conversation with the leadership team yesterday, and the different aspects of it. I think you hear the term AI and people jump back to some of the more dystopian sci-fi movies of, when's Skynet going online or robots taking over the world. And instead it's those two different categories of the more engaging AI that we're now starting to deal with that lifted off of Alexa and Google, and I'm not going to say the other one because then my phone's going to go off and ask me what I want. But yeah, and then those things that are just built into what we kind of all do every day. And so before we dive more into that topic, we always like to discuss with our guests at the table a little bit more about you. So let's take a step back for a second. And obviously, before getting to where you are now with Paradox AI, you had quite an interesting journey to get there. And that started where we're fellow Illinoisans. You were with McDonald's, very involved in getting their platform, McHire, off the ground, which inevitably begot Paradox. But how would you experience or describe that experience and how it kind of set the stage for Paradox to launch into all it's doing now, and how you're supporting restaurants across the US and beyond?
Yeah. So for me, I've always I've loved this idea of like building great teams and believe that great teams could be the difference maker in businesses. I think so many of you running amazing restaurants or restaurant groups probably see the same thing of like the magic of having like an awesome team in restaurant, or for me in corporations, etc. So that was always like my drive. I got to kind of get to do it at the one of the largest possible scales within a McDonald's, which was pretty neat, but also pretty intimidating. Frankly, like stepping into it, we have 37,000 and counting restaurants. We were doing about 2 million hires per year. In my role, it was 120 countries, but then, over 90, I think it's now over 92, 93% are owner operators. So that meant a lot of listening and collaborating. But I got really fascinated because of that scale in terms of what AI or automation could do in the hiring space, right? If you're operating at that scale, you basically would say, wow, like we can't just go off and hire more and more recruiters, or our restaurants can't just hire an extra person to handle staffing. We have to look for ways to do this via technology. And so kind of like for all of us stepping into a role, whether we've purchased a new restaurant group or whatever else it is, added a new franchise, you kind of start to look at just like what are the challenges that we're trying to solve first. And for a McDonald's, and I think this is probably shared across the board, was like, we were pretty consistently understaffed. We could see that an understaffed restaurant, and I know we'll get into this a little bit more, but we could see an understaffed restaurant drove less revenue. For us, that was during like peak lunchtime and dinner hours. You could actually see our drive-through lines get longer or people pull away. So it's kind of super easy. I can actually quantify that in a little bit. So one, how do I keep as many restaurants fully staffed as possible? That's challenge one. Two, our managers, like all of yours, are the ones doing our hiring. We didn't have like a centralized team, sending people into restaurants. It was our managers. Our managers are heroes and incredible and wearing 12 different hats and correlated the most to driving revenue per restaurant. A great manager drove more revenue, drove better teams. We saw when we were understaffed, higher turnover for managers, higher turnover for the teams. We saw our managers were, because we were consistently understaffed, they were spending 7 to 8 hours doing manual recruiting. It's pretty a lot. And then the last piece was, it was taking us, for McDonald's, it was taking us between 14 days and 21 days to hire in a restaurant. We call our team members crew members. That's a pretty decent amount of time when you think about it from a customer perspective. Okay, we know from the revenue, the restaurant isn't working as efficiently, right? I'm not getting my order as fast when the restaurant's understaffed. With me as a customer, I'm getting served a little bit less fast. I'm getting my resolutions handled a little bit slower. I may not come back to that restaurant again, or I may think twice about it, right? So I'm starting to have a poor customer experience for those 14 to 21 days when I'm understaffed.
Sure,
so
absolutely.
Higher turnover, all those things. And so we were kind of looking at, hey, what could be next gen out there that wasn't just, I think my experiences with buying tech in the past had always been like, you had a problem with one piece of tech and then you bought a new piece of tech and it was like 5% better, but then also had gaps. And we were just kind of trying to have this like next generation kind of like leapfrog, even if it was taking on some risk, if we were going to be a first mover. And so that's where we basically leaned really heavily into this company that I'm at now, Paradox, where we said, how much can we automate before the interview and after the interview to move as faster than anybody else in the industry, and to also drive higher quality of hire, and to save money, and to essentially provide a great candidate experience, because for us, as of all of you, a lot of our candidates are our customers. So it was kind of this like, could we do it? These big stretch goals, and we ended up actually really being able to do it with this form of automation that we'll talk about. We essentially took our hiring down from 21 days to 3 days. Our hiring managers went from spending about 8 hours per week down to about 2 to 3 hours per week. And the way to think about that is like just interviewing people, like all the administrative stuff got automated. Just interview, pick the people you want in your restaurants who have the hours and the shifts that'll serve you best. Our candidate satisfaction went from us not measuring it and a lot of people just kind of probably not hearing back from us to close to a 98% satisfaction rate. We doubled our applications, which meant we were also able to cut our advertising spend on Indeed. So we got to do all these things. So it was really transformational for us in a way that was like, oh, those are great, like recruiting and HR stats, but they're actually great business results. And so I got really passionate on, my two favorite things now. If you assemble great teams, you can drive business results. And then, I really like hiring and recruiting. And there seems to be something new out there that felt like, if I could help more restaurants or retailers do stuff like this, could really help their businesses and provide better experiences. So joined Paradox, and I spend a lot of my time on talking with our clients, figuring out their hacks and best practices, and connecting them with one another and sharing their stories in market. So hesitate to even call it marketing. We try to have our clients kind of speak as much as possible on our behalf, but having a lot of fun with that and going on year 3.
Josh, one of the points I want to touch on that you mentioned is that there's a higher turnover rate among managers. I think the perception in the restaurant industry is being understaffed can negatively impact your guest experience, which it certainly can, right? But I think people forget about how it affects your staff internally. So I just wanted to point that out. And then for our listeners out there, if you want to just take a gander at Mick Hire, I recommend Googling it. You can kind of see what Josh is talking about from a firsthand experience. One thing I forgot to bring up at the beginning of the episode is, Josh, I gave you a heads up in our preliminary call, but just a reminder, it's a standard question that we ask all our guests on the podcast. So I want you to start thinking about it now as we get closer to the end. But the standard question we ask everybody is, what is your favorite ingredient to cook with? And then what is your favorite ingredient to success? So I just wanted to plant that there before I ask you maybe the most important question of today's episode. So we've been hearing a lot of different forms of artificial intelligence. Paradox specializes in conversational, but what is the difference between this and then generative AI?
Yeah, and so we'll kind of get into it, and I'll use some very kind of high level ways for us to be thinking about it. So wow, generative AI, huh? Like exploded on the scene. We all started hearing about it really almost like beginning of last year through ChatGPT, right? ChatGPT kind of exploded. Now ChatGPT is an interesting example because it uses both conversational AI and generative AI. So I want to kind of pull those two things apart, and then I'll reconnect them. So generative AI, right? It's learning from a large set of data and then can create something new. So that might be, and we're all seeing it, right? It might be an image, it might be a video, it might be a new song, it might be a new poem. So that it can actually learn, and then with statistical accuracy, create something new based on a prompt. Okay, and that's pretty different than like some of the AI before, which could go in and leverage insights or analyze text, etc. For conversational AI, right? That we're all pretty familiar with, even if we don't know we're familiar with it, right? It's Siri on our phone, it's the Echoes in our house, it's the Google Voices. What that allows, right, is essentially computer or a phone, which is also a computer, right, to interpret language, understand it, and then be able to communicate, right? And so we saw that pretty early on, maybe even just before sort of the Siri Alexa days, in what I'd call like sort of like preliminary chatbots. And what those look like, and I think we can all, sometimes we see them still on sites, but it's it'll ask you a question and then almost like provide you a prompt, pick 1, 2, or 3. And it's kind of trying to chart you down a specific path. You're not really
digital version of a choose your own adventure storybook at that point.
Boom. It's great example of it. It then over the last 7 years, it's gotten more sophisticated. It's the technology we're more used to. It's supported by what is called natural language processing, and that's just basically it can understand us, and most importantly, it understands some context and like what we're trying to ask or what we're trying to say, because then it can pull from typically like a database of responses and make sure that we're getting the right response. But it makes it feel pretty fluid, and that technology has gotten better and better. So now when we're combining the two, and ChatGPT did this and kind of did it with like the most recognition, and I think it's great, is you can now you can converse in natural language to create things, right? And as we talk about this within the hiring space, that's actually really exciting, because forget all the applications of like, well, I'm never going to ask in a hiring prompt to like create a video or create a poem. I actually just specifically don't want them to do that. But what you do want is a conversation that is fast, right? Gets the person what they want. Maybe that's a benefits related question or a reason they'd want to work there, or a tip on why on how to best prepare for the interview. Super accurate. Really smooth conversationally. Why does that matter? Because anytime there's clunkiness or frustration, you might have somebody drop off of the process. So if you're still using, let's say, like an applicant tracking system where there's a login or a password even, right? You're creating this barrier, and the average drop off at that point where you prompt somebody to create a login or passwords, usually about 70%. That's average. So just conversational, not even with generative, has gone to that being, you know, over a 95% completion rate. So pretty cool, even
Wow.
just like that difference. So now adding generative in, the way to think about this super simplistically is those chat experiences for us as consumers when we go to websites, as well as for our candidates when they, you know, go through this process, is just going to be that much more accurate, that much smoother, that much easier. Fewer moments of that like frustration. I just want to talk to a human type of thing.
So, let's actually kind of dive a little deeper into this and talk a little bit more about the automation of the process and really how side by side it transforms bringing in a new employee. I think you hit on two really important things earlier about, AI does have, there's the automation side, there's the generative side, and the impact, whether it's saving time on the manager, the overall manager's morale, clearly your turnaround time to hiring. I was on a tech and automation panel, or of course we started talking about AI, even though we didn't intend to, but one of the things we're talking about there was how just automation in certain tasks. Domino's brought in a robot, gave it a cool name that's approachable by the team, and its purpose is not to replace the people that are stretching the dough, but to train the people to stretch the dough. And so it used to take them 21 days to train someone just to stretch the dough on the pizza, which is step one to anything Domino's is going to put out the door, right? And now this robot is teaching them within 48 to 72 hours. So it's cut that training time down to next to nothing. So from a hiring perspective, I think, the average restaurateur, and certainly, a majority of our members are independent single unit operators or multi-unit small groups. And so they're very much hands-on. They're owner operators. They're there every day.
Yep.
And this does take a lot of time. I mean, anytime I ever had to hire someone, it was like, if I've got to fill one server position and I've got to meet 20 candidates, where am I fitting the time in my day to do that between being out on the floor with customers, dealing with the kitchen, et cetera, right? And so to your point of you put out an application, whether they come in and fill it out or they fill it out online, then you're trying to schedule that time for them to come in, hoping that you're not pulled away doing something else and then sitting down with them. And so that's where everyone kind of comes from, thinking about the traditional finding the candidate, getting them in the door, sitting down, and then finally having that interview. With Paradox using conversational AI, let's just walk through kind of step by step how that transforms and changes this whole process just because of where we are now with conversational AI.
Yeah, because I think that's a really good point, Joe. And I'm just like, hey, what are we all used to up until this point today? And it is interesting as you go through like what we've been used to step by step, right? Because it is that like the job opens, we then have to write a job description, we then have to post it, we then wait some time for enough applicants to come in. Our managers and we sleep, so we're not working 24/7. So there are time lags in there. We finally find somebody we really like. We text them or we send them an email to say we'd love to meet you. And there's another time lag. They're not going to respond to us right away. Then we're trying to figure out the scheduling. Hopefully we can get them in the next few days. And then 40 or 50% of them ghost us on the day of the interview. So there's some frustration there. And then onboarding is pretty clunky too. A lot of our restaurant groups before they work with us, and this was kind of mind-blowing to me before I joined restaurants, but on average between 30 and 35% this is a stat more for QSR. So if you're in fine dining, it's going to be lower, but 35% drop after accepting your offer and then starting on day one, which is pretty wild. A lot of times it's just that complexity of like onboarding and they maybe haven't done it before and intimidated by that, or they get another offer. So I think that's like a good basis. I'll share, this is maybe a good one for a visual, just as I'm talking through it so everybody can kind of see it in a way that's hopefully not too intimidating. What I wanted to walk through is really this idea of using conversational AI in an apply process, why this is so easy. So now you have something that's 24/7 for your candidates. They can speak or apply in any language they want to, and the system will understand it. You can actually go through then and do the screening. So this takes out any forms, logins, or passwords, which in frontline, it's a place where we see actually a lot of drop off. And a lot of times for our screening, it's pretty basic stuff. What hours can you work? Can you work in the US? You know, are you of age? Have you served before? Have you worked here before? Right? Like we just want some of those basic things to say like, oh yeah, you pass all those things, great. Like come in, get in here as fast as you can. Another interesting part on the supply process is you framed it up really nicely. We're all kind of in this really competitive environment, and not to intimidate everybody, but it's like the environment's actually more competitive than we even think it is, because right the overall demand for work versus the supply is pretty outrageous. Right now with a 3.7 unemployment rate, the gap is it's what is it 2.9 million nationwide, which is almost all frontline. But then this is an interesting one for everybody is for those of us that post on Indeed, love Indeed, but people on average apply to 15 to 17 jobs per week on Indeed. So when you get an application that comes through, you're actually competing for these limited resources against probably 16 other people. So this idea of being really fast. So then the next piece is, all right, so you want to make sure there's this little friction in your apply process. What we're finding is that conversational really helps that because it takes off some of those, the password friction points, right? The login friction points. So you don't have to update or upload a resume, which a lot of these candidates maybe don't have. They maybe don't even have an email. Then you can quickly screen and then you can automatically schedule. So now something that was usually taking most of us 48 hours, 72 hours before someone's like committed to an interview, we're doing in probably 3 minutes on average in restaurant space. And so what that
is all, you know, just since people are watching the visual, let's give her the props she deserves. So that's all Olivia, right? And I think that goes back to the approachability of this is you all have given a personality to this AI. Granted, some companies choose to customize it even more so to their company culture, but in general, be it Alexa or any other, yours is Olivia, and so they do have that feeling of talking with someone as they're going through this process.
Yeah, and what that provides is not only are you removing some of those barriers and making it fast, but it can make sure that it keeps the person engaged. So let's say they even walk away, you know, Olivia can kind of keep nudging. Hey, you know, I'd love for you to be able to complete that. Can actually remind before the interview to make sure. What we're seeing is the best performing companies are scheduling the interview and interviewing the person within 48 hours. So it is that competitive out there. And you can kind of just see like just some of these niceties of sometimes people say, oh, like automation, I don't want to, you know, one of the magics of my pieces of my brand, you know, is sort of this human interaction. And it's like, actually, if you can on a one-to-one basis provide sort of, you know, curated answers to questions to people, flexibility to like reschedule, reminders, respecting their time. It's why the client or the candidate satisfaction rate is so high. And then I like this. This is just kind of the back end, and these will be the last ones to show you. But it's how do you make it as simple as easy for a manager? And so you can either integrate it into your manager's calendar, or we have a native calendar, and they just basically drag and drop. Hey, these are my slow times, and you know Olivia's going to automatically schedule in. If you have a job opening, we'll know what types of jobs you have. And so, you know, it's just you basically toggle the job on in the shifts and it automatically posts to Indeed, Google job boards. If you are a part of a large organization, then it would post to that. You can actually send offers. You can do referrals through this. You know, your employees can just send one text. You can even do like your video interviews through it. So kind of back to that, what we were doing in a few weeks and letting our restaurants stay open, you now, whether you decide to use sort of this conversational way, it's now possible to do this in 3 days while sort of like allowing your team to step back. But importantly, still weigh in where it matters. You know, there are some industries, manufacturing, plants or warehouses that don't have any human interaction in the hiring space. Almost all of our restaurant clients try to speed up to the point of interview, and then they spend a good amount of time with the candidate to walk them around their restaurant and kind of woo as well as interview.
I want to call out one important piece of that, Josh, is, I think it's important to remind our listeners that a platform like this that focuses on conversational AI is open 24/7, whereas, some restaurant groups may just have a hiring department that's open Monday through Friday, and they may not get to some of these applicants until the following Monday, right? We're an industry that hardly sleeps, and so some of these applicants will probably take their time to apply for a job in the wee hours of the morning after they get off their night shift. So I think it's important just to comment on that one more time. One of our goals in our podcast is to help restaurateurs become better operators, and a lot of the time that's improving their bottom line. And so my next question is going back to the understaffing. What can understaffing cost you?
This is my favorite question. We're going to geek out a little bit. My initial response would be, we all know it's not zero, right? Because if it is zero, we're not understaffed, right? We're actually overstaffed. You have now just found your appropriate staffing level. Okay, so I think we're all in agreement to start. It's not zero. I would also say it has to be more than a shift of what you're paying a person, right? And so what Texas, you guys are going to, is it $12 an hour in July, minimum wage?
Couple of cities, but for the
Couple
most part
cities,
across
okay.
the state, it's pretty standard still.
And it's super competitive. So let's even say it's what, $15 an hour. So, and challenge me on this, but I would at least say it's minimally, right, more than your $15 an hour times 8 your shift.
Yeah.
Okay,
Well,
so now we're at,
remember that, with where we're at now, you got your tipped employees are sitting at an average of $35 an hour, bartenders 50 to 75, and then you turn around to even frontline QSR employees in today's competitive environment. So to your point of not just can you get a hold of them when they're applying for 15 different jobs, but the only way to track them in, regardless of a statewide $7.25 minimum wage, already entry-level QSR frontline workers are coming in, and especially in areas like Austin and Houston and Dallas, $12, $13, $14, $15 or up.
Yeah. So, I mean, and that's really interesting. So, I mean, whatever that is for your restaurant, it's a good way to calculate it, right? And you'd say, all right, just using that math, 15 times 8, right? We're at $120. So we're minimally saying, again, we wouldn't bring the person on if we felt like our revenue, short-term or long-term, is less than $120 a day, because then we're still losing money. If we don't feel like there are benefits, long-term or short-term, then again, we wouldn't hire that person. So we're minimally at a place where you're probably, above 120. Statistically, what that number actually is it ranges pretty widely. It's usually between $200 and $700 per day of lost revenue. Most of this data, for those of you doing more fine dining or restaurant space, does come from more QSR, because it's a little bit easier to measure that metric during your busiest times. But I think we all can anecdotally say, hey, we've all been down that one bartender or couple servers where we know minimally we're not getting that extra drink out, that extra dessert out, sacrificing some customer experience. So, 200 to 700, 900, and sometimes even more for that fine dining. But so that is short-term revenue loss. That is by day. What's not even calculated in there would be, I think what a lot of us would see is like pretty brand damaging. If you're consistently understaffed when your customer is interacting with you, what's the impact in addition to lost future revenues, negative reviews? So, one of the things that's pretty well covered. And then the other one was, the more you're understaffed, the more vulnerable you are to involuntary turnover, which is just going to get you into more and more of a dip. So you've actually got a pretty good amount of stuff that says, wow, being fully staffed more days out of the year than understaffed is going to be able to drive my business quite a significant amount more. So I think it's an interesting way to be thinking about it. It was one of the ways for us at McDonald's that really kind of convinced our leadership to get on board. Hey, if we're 20% understaffed at any given time, and we can get that down to 5% understaffed, and then even when we are understaffed, we're not taking 21 days to fill, we're doing it in 3 days, multiply it out. I mean, you're saving millions, and in our case, billions of dollars of revenue that could be coming in. So it's really interesting within that restaurant space of like speed to hire.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that I would just call out, and I think this is really fascinating, and this comes from a case study we just did with Southern Rock Restaurant Groups. They have over about 100 McAllister delis. So again, you're kind of in that QSR space. But what they found is they went from about 10 days on average to hire to 1.5 days. So from time someone completed an application to offer and start, 1.5 days, pretty wild. What they actually found was their retention rates went way up. And when you talk to them, some of this wasn't even the technology. It was, hey, we had so many more candidates to interview. We were able to pick the cream of the crop, the people with the behaviors that we wanted showing the McAllister's brand. And frankly, the people who had the hours that we wanted to, that we needed filled. And we were able to give those better people, quote unquote, more hours. And so they were really satisfied with it. So their retention rates went way up. So I thought that was interesting because I think a lot of times the pushback, and that would have been my concern initially. It's like, great, you can move fast, but I don't want just anybody coming in. I want to have a better team over time. And I think that's interesting. That's not true in the corporate space. Just because you hire faster doesn't mean you're hiring better. In frontline space, we are seeing the data show you're getting people that stay longer and perform better.
Well, to your point, to be able to look at a bigger batch of resumes and engage with faster and get them in. And then the flip side of this, I want to kind of expand out a little bit, because I think this is also another area where the ROI on streamlining things like this, like, HR is an inevitable component of any business, but for a restaurant operator, it's not something that's directly impacting your customer experience, quality of the food. Obviously, having the right staff is critical, but the